had an op-ed in the Washington Post, which he entitled words to the effect of the essential nation, referring to the United States. And he's used that phrase a lot. You have a recent piece out called, "Is the United States the Essential Nation?" And of course, you take issue with the president. What is your issue with the president when he claims we are the essential nation?
Well, I mean, first of all, the hubris that's in that statement. What are we essential to? The Biden administration has made preservation of what they call the rules-based international order the foremost foreign policy objective. But what is the rules-based international order? One would think that the United States, and Judge, I think you would understand this, being a constitutional republic where we are founded upon the principles, the values that are inherent in the Constitution. That is a body of law upon which we are defined. That we would be more accurate to call ourselves, a law-based international order. That should be what we want. But a rules-based international order. What is a rules-based international order? It means it's not lawful. It means it's something other than law. It means it's something that we have dictated to others that they must follow. So we are essential to a rules-based international order. But is a rules-based international order essential to the world? And the answer is no. It's not. Ukraine is a example of this. What are we essential for in Ukraine? Let's put it this way. This Ukraine conflict is going to end sooner rather than later. And when it does, the American people will have forgotten it just as quickly as we forgot the Afghan conflict. You remember the other existential crisis that we faced just a couple of years ago. Right. And it's the same thing with Israel. We're essential for what? For the preservation of the Zionist entity? So no, the president wrote this opinion piece, this op-ed piece, and I took umbrage. He says that we're in an inflection point in history, and that I do agree with him. We are at an inflection point where America is becoming increasingly the irrelevant nation in the world because we have chosen to embrace the rules-based international order while the rest of the world is talking about the United Nations Charter, which is a law-based order.
Remember Kissinger, it is dangerous to be America's enemy. It is fatal to be America's friend. Just ask Vladimir Zelensky and General Zaluzhny and the mothers and fathers of the 500,000 young Ukrainian men killed or so disabled they can never go back to a normal life again. I mean, I think a lot of this started with George W. Bush and the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11 and the extraordinary manifestation of hubris. Get our minds off of 9/11. Forget about the fact that you slept at the switch. Forget about the fact that your Saudi buddies financed it. Let's blame it all on the Afghans. Let's do what 25,000 British soldiers couldn't do in the 19th century and 100,000 Soviet troops couldn't do in the 20th century. Let's turn Afghanistan into a democracy and prove that we spread democracy. Baloney, we spread violence, death, and destruction. Am I getting carried away?
Yeah, I right after 9/11, I think it was actually in October of 2001, I was on the History Channel doing a debate with Richard Holbrooke, and he's he's deceased now, unfortunately, but he was a well-known American diplomat. He helped negotiate the end to the Kosovo conflict, and he also later on became the head of the Afghan-Pakistan policy team for the Obama administration. But at that time, he was advocating very strongly in favor of a military intervention. And I said, well, why don't we try a diplomatic intervention? He said, with whom? I said, well, what about the moderate wing of the Taliban? He said, there's no such thing as the moderate wing of the Taliban. And I said, well, do you know who the foreign minister is, Mutawakil? Have you listened to him? It's very moderate what he's saying. He's saying that he's willing to talk to the United States about the crimes committed by al-Qaeda. And if the United States can document these crimes, then under the Pashtunwali, the Pashtun tribal code, because Afghan is a Pashtun-dominated nation, they brought Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda in as their guests, and if they violated Islamic tenets while guests, they must be held accountable too. And he said the Taliban will hold him to account if you can document the crimes. But the United States said, no, we've already found you guilty. We're going to come in and we're going to remove you. So we engaged from the very start, not just about a war of retribution against Osama bin Laden, but a war of regime change against the Taliban. Today, the Taliban's back in power. That didn't go very well. And the other thing is Al Qaeda has expanded its presence globally. So we failed in that too.
Well, it was a miserable failure on the part of the Bush administration. Maybe one of the worst foreign policy decisions of the modern era. Another horrific foreign policy decision of the modern era is to convince President Zelensky that Vladimir Putin is a monster unworthy of entering into with a treaty, and that we would so back him up with sufficient moral, political, emotional, international, financial, and military support that he would never be wanting. Now he's wanting. Zelensky.
Look, one of the big problems here, let's look at two foundational elements of that, of what you brought here. The first one is we don't care about Ukraine. Let's just be honest for once as the American people. Just like we didn't care about Afghanistan, we don't care about Ukraine. You know, do you remember when we were talking about how we were going to save the Afghan women, how we were going to come in and put Western values, turn Afghanistan into a forward-thinking country because it was so important, not only for the humanity of the Afghans, but also because we had to transform Afghanistan so we would fight the enemy over there, keep them over there, so we didn't have to fight them here at home. But overnight, all that went away. Who's talking about the Afghan women today? Who's talking about the Afghan? No one, because we never really cared about them. It was always political garbage, hot air. The same with Ukraine. All the Americans have put the Ukrainian flag on their social media is a little feel-good thing. You don't care about Ukraine. You never had. That flag will be gone. It's probably already gone now that Ukraine has lost. You don't want to be associated with losers because you never really believed in them. Ukraine has lost. We're abandoning them like the bad habit they are. This is the fact. The other thing is, why did we do this? We did it because we said,
that's the question. That's the $64,000 question. And that gets us back to the government's belief that we are essential.
But it's more than that, Judge. It's arrogance and it's ignorance. To give you an example, my good friend Seymour Hersh, and he is my good friend. I've known him for 25 years, but he put out a Substack that I take umbrage at. Not against him. His job is to report, but he's quoting a source or sources within the U.S. government about so-called negotiations that are taking place between Ukraine and Russia, between Zaluzhny, the head Ukraine military guy, and Gerasimov, the head of the Russian. And just on the surface, this is so absurd, it's beyond belief. A, Gerasimov constitutionally is not permitted to engage in these kinds of negotiations. So right off the bat, you want me to believe that Russia has waived all constitutional due process, et cetera, to allow this conversation to occur. Two, like it's premised on the notion of a frozen conflict that would freeze Russia's line, leaving important elements of Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia, and Donetsk in Ukrainian control. That can't happen because constitutionally they belong to Russia, and Russia can't freeze that. That requires the legislator, the Duma, together with the president, to reapproach the issue and get permission to do this constitutionally. That hasn't happened, and it won't happen. And lastly, it's premised on, once this happens, that Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO. Russia went to war to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. And to believe any of this, you have to say that Russia's losing this conflict. But we know now that they're not. There's not anybody out there today, with the exception of maybe Jack Devine, who is articulating that Russia is losing this war. But now we come. Why did this article get published? Because it's designed to sow the seeds of doubt in the minds of a Russian population that we continue to believe to be susceptible to disinformation, to get them to doubt their government, doubt the sincerity of their government, to promote discontent that can rise to the point of a Moscow Maidan moment to remove Putin from power. And there it is, Judge, the answer to the $64,000 question. Why did we do all this? because we somehow believed that Vladimir Putin was vulnerable and that if we could expose him to the political pitfalls of economic sanctions combined with military difficulties in Ukraine, that the Russian people would rise up and remove him from power. He is the most popular president in the history of Russia. The Russian people are 100% behind him. The Russian economy is stronger than it's ever been. The Russian military is the strongest military in the world. We failed, as we always do, when we have the hubris and the arrogance to say we are the essential nation. Because the moment we say that, we blind ourselves to the reality of the world out there. Rather than saying we are the essential nations, we should say we are a nation that is engaged in very complex problems with other nations that we need to understand better if we are to come up with solutions that actually solve the problem. But you can't solve a problem unless you first adequately define the problem. Right. And when we define the problem in Ukraine as the potential of getting rid of Russian President Vladimir Putin, we'll never have a solution.
Has the have the powers that be in Washington come to the realization that Ukraine is lost? The reason I ask this is somebody that you and I keep poking in the ribs all the time because he never met a war that he didn't want somebody else to fight. Lindsey Graham made a unique statement over the weekend that he will oppose further aid to Ukraine unless it's combined with building a border wall. And of course, there's really no connection between the two. But the fact that he would say that, knowing the Democrats are against it and knowing Zelensky is on his last leg, makes me wonder if even he and Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and the president, to the extent he knows what's going on, are looking for an off-ramp.
I think they found their off-ramp, and their off-ramp is the funding. And this is, this is all about politics. It's never about Ukraine. Remember, we were with Ukraine until the end. We're going to stand with you until the end. We're not standing there now because
the end is here.
And so what is Lindsey Graham saying? Don't blame me. Not my fault. I supported Ukraine, and I would support Ukraine again, he's saying. But first, we have to do a politically impossible task that the Biden administration isn't going to do because we're in that silly season leading up to a presidential election. So he knows that Biden can't make the compromises that are required for him to support the funding. And so it's the same thing, but it's the end for you. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, just spoke and said, look, 97% of the funds are done. There's nothing left. We're done. Ukraine's out of money. Germany has told the European Union they're not going to contribute anymore to the European Union Save Ukraine Fund. Ukraine is broke, not just broken, but broke. It's all over, but the shouting. I just remind people when I say it's all over, that doesn't mean that the fighting is going to stop. At the Second World War, the bloodiest month for Americans in Europe was not D-Day, it was not the Battle of the Bulge. It was April 1945, after we had strategically defeated the Germans.